Hello everyone, welcome to my pretty rare deck tech. I think this is my second one. I was asked to do this for my standard deck that I finished third at Standard Showdown on the weekend. This is Grixis Drakes. I'm not claiming this to be anything original. I basically just took an existing archetype, which was Is It Drakes, and made a few modifications specific to my local meta. So this might not be suitable for you, but and there are a few things, because I didn't test this at all. I sleeved it up and played it, so there might be a few things that you want to change. So I'm going to quickly get into it. The creature base is pretty standard. You have the two drakes, the Crackling Drake and the Enigma Drake, as well as a new card, the Pteramander. 12 creatures, that's it. You got a ton of cantrips, Opt, Dispersal Discovery, and also I'm going to talk a little bit about Thought Erasure shortly, but those are the main ones. Dispersal Discovery, I don't think I've ever used Discovery, so it's particularly there for Discovery. Now the difference in this deck compared to Is It obviously is in the removal. You can see I have Cast Down, Bedevil, and Moment of Craving that you don't have access to in Is It colors. Cast Down I thought was a direct competition with Lava Coil. I didn't like Lava Coil because it was sorcery speed. This deck I think really needs to play after turn 3. It really needs to play at instant speed, so I took Cast Down because it's a good one to cast at instant speed even late in the game. There are some drawbacks to that which I'll get into later. You can see the 2 copies of Bedevil there. I chose this over Vraska's Contempt for 2 reasons. One, because I don't own any Vraska's Contempts, so all these cards are cards that I own. And 2, because it's instant speed and it comes a turn earlier. And the other quirky card you might notice in there is a one-of Mission Briefing. The reason I have this is for 2 reasons. One, to flashback spells, which I did a couple of times. It's very useful. And the other one is to correct my draws, because you get the Surveil too. Now the Surveil has 2 functions in this deck. The first one is that it puts instants and sorceries into the graveyard to power up your drakes. And the other one is that it can help correct your draws, find lands and find specific cards. I've only got a one-of. I thought this card was fantastic every single time I drew it. I loved it. I don't know if the deck can support 2, but it's definitely a one that I'm going to keep. And you can see finally the Thought Erasure. So I'm just going to talk a bit about the difference between this deck and the Is It version. The main difference obviously comes down to your removal suite. So I have access to Bedevil and Cast Down. Moment of Craving to a lesser extent because it gives you life gain, and it's pretty good against a lot of decks, particularly the Golgari, where you can put the Explore trigger on the stack and get their creatures in response. Cast Down was far more flexible against certain decks that play legendary creatures. Obviously it has to come out, but Bedevil can hit everything, including planeswalkers, so that's important. The other big difference with the black is a choice between Thought Erasure and Charter Course. Now Charter Course is obviously card advantage. It draws you 2 cards and potentially discard one. The discard, again, as I mentioned before, is important because it allows you to put an instant or sorcery into the graveyard to fuel your drakes. So quite often you would want to do that before combat, but Thought Erasure can do that as well. It has Surveil, so once you've taken a key card, you can then Surveil and put it into the grave, so it also can fix your draws. Now the main difference here being that Thought Erasure can take down, say, Carnage Tyrant, which this deck and also the Is It deck cannot do. And it can also nab key pieces such as Planeswalkers, or can clear the way of taking out removal on turn 2 so that you can play your Enigma Drake on turn 3, things like that. And this is kind of a classic in Magic between hand disruption and counter spells. And depending on how you want to play, I thought I wanted to be more aggressive and proactive, so I went with Thought Erasure over Charter Course. The other thing is that Charter Course often resolves, whereas Thought Erasure usually always gets a counter spell if they have it in hand, and most times that's what you're trying to get out of their hand. You can see my land base here. This is largely dictated by what I have on hand, because I've sent my Watery Graves away to be signed, so I've only got one left. I've got 5 of them, so I'm playing 1 Watery Grave. I'd potentially play 2. The key with your mana here, you can see I've got 3 mountains, 3 islands. I don't have any swamps. You only want to be hitting swamps on turn 2, or you want to have access to black on turn 2, whereas you really need to be hitting an untapped island, on turn 1 to play your Pteramander. Pteramander on turn 1 is quite important in a number of matchups. So that's the deck. If I go to the sideboard now, this again, I mentioned this is very specific for my local meta, which has a lot of aggressive decks. So you can see the full Fountain of Renewal because this deck cannot gain life. I'm going to talk about matchups in a little bit, but that can be the difference between winning and losing a lot of them. But having tested this and run it for the first time on the weekend, I would probably switch a number of those out and bring in a conditionary sweeper like Fiery Temper that's instant speed, or Cry of the Canarium, which is played at sorcery speed, but Canarium can also get Adanto Vanguards. So I'd probably take at least 2 sweepers next time, but that's a slot I'd be looking at. The 4 Duress is just good against a number of decks that don't have a lot of creatures, including the Gates and the control decks. Syncopate there is an awesome card for, if it can tag something, and I mean the card draw. I forget the name. I'll put it in the preview. That has flashback. You can actually exile it so they can't flash it back. It also gets a Nexus of Fate. You can exile the Nexus of Fate rather than having them shuffle it back into their grave as well, into their hand deck, which is very important. You can see the 3 negates and disdainful strokes are your counterspells. I've got an unmoored ego just to go after decks that rely on 1 or 2 cards, but that might actually come out as well. I didn't use that at all. It's kind of a trap card, that one. And finally, Entrancing Melody, that's there to as a kind of a momentum swinger in a number of matchups against mono blue aggro. You can basically, for 3 mana, you can steal their Curious Obsession creature and have a creature of Curious Obsession. It's much easier to do in that matchup, particularly if you have the Duresses and the Thought Erasures, because you can get rid of their protection, then steal the creature, and that usually wins you the match. It can also get a Hydroid Crassus for very cheap, and those are the 2 main reasons for it. You wouldn't bring it in against, say, Golgari, because there's nothing that you particularly want to get that's going to swing the match incredibly in your favour. So that is the deck. In terms of best opening hands, what you're looking for, 2 potential opening hands. One is a lot of cantrips. You don't necessarily need to have a creature, but a lot of cantrips is very important. Whatever your opening hand is, it must have cantrips. You wouldn't take a hand that was just reactive, say a couple of Drakes and some counterspells. You would not take that hand. You need a Pteramander on turn 1 is usually perfect. And the second hand you would take is one that does curve into a Drake. So something like a turn 2 Dispersal into a turn 3 Enigma Drake is not a bad pickup either, particularly if you've got something like a Spell Pierce or a Dive Down as your 1-drop. Again, just to emphasize, you need the cantrips. This deck does not work unless you can be cantripping early, so you kind of have to mulligan to find the cantrips. If I go along to the I'm only going to talk about 4 matchups, which are matchups that I've actually played this deck against. The first is the Golgari, which I think is a pretty easy matchup, because Golgari is a kind of a grindy deck. It grinds you out with value through the explore triggers, and so you're just too fast for them. And especially game 1, they don't have creature removal other than the Ravenous Chupacabra, so you can and when you've got protection against a couple of cards they might have, you can snag game 1 very quickly. So what we do with Golgari is we need the cantrips again early. They don't tend to strip your hand, but if you can even say have an Enigma Drake or a Crackling Drake with a Dive Down, you're normally going to win that match. And the other key is that you have to take out their Wild Growth Walker, because the life gain from the explore triggers is quite difficult to race. I did actually win one game where he had a wild growth walker and gained about 10 life, but you could still outrace them at the same time. In terms of sideboarding, what I do is I normally take out 2 Spell Pierce, because you're not tagging, they don't have a hell of a lot of threats for you to tag. Removal for you to tag with the Spell Pierce. I bring in a Syncopate and a Disdainful Stroke, because the Syncopate is good, particularly early, because they tend to tap out, so you can get them from turn 2. And Disdainful Stroke, because the main things you're looking for are Vraska's Contempt, Ravenous Chupacabra, and Vivian Reed. Vivian's a tough one because she can minus and take down one of your key threats. But at the same time, you don't necessarily worry too much, because if she minuses, you can dive down and protect, and then she's in all sorts of trouble. She's pretty much dead to whatever your creature is. The other key for this in terms of your removal is you keep the shocks at the moment of craving, because Explore triggers go on the stack, so you get them with the Explore trigger on the stack. And so a shock on a say a Jade-like Ranger is really good. The other thing to keep in mind is they have the card that recurs creatures from the graveyard, can get back 2 creatures. But again, it's a bit dawdly and slow. I don't really mind that card too much, because you're racing and you're too fast for them. So the key to beating Golgari is usually just one dive down is enough to get the job done. The next matchup is the Gates deck, and the variation of Gates decks. This is kind of an easy one if you know how to play this match and what they're trying to do. The key for this gate is twofold. One is the Guildgate Summit on turn 3 enables the card draw. That's not necessarily their best card against you, because all their lands come in tapped virtually, so they're playing a turn behind. When you're racing and you're being aggressive, that's already good for you. That's a key thing to remember. But also because the Guild Summit draws them a card, and by the time they can take advantage of that card advantage, often it's too late. The key one that you really have to get is the Wilderness Reclamation that comes down on turn 4. And the other key card was Gates Ablaze. I got absolutely blown out by this. I had lethal on board in game 1, and I was Gates Ablazed, and I didn't have a Spell Pierce to protect, and I didn't have a dive down to keep one of my creatures alive. He wiped the board, and there's no coming back from that. In terms of their threats, they can be blocked by yours, but oftentimes you just want to race them, because the key here as well is to get down 2 Drakes, and you can usually outrace whatever they've got. So in terms of sideboarding against the Gates deck, I take out 3 dive downs because they don't tend to have spot removal. I take out the Craving and the 3 shocks, so that's 7 cards down. I bring in 3 negates and 4 duress, and particularly if you have duress on turn 1, you can usually just do enough damage to hold them off. The next matchup was Jeskai Control, where the key for winning this one, I won this match quite easily, was to have a Terramander on turn 1. They don't have any answers they tend not to play shocks, so if you can Terramander turn 1, particularly with a Spell Pierce or a Dive Down, they're in big trouble, because they're always playing behind. And so what they want to do is build toward their sweepers, which would be Settle the Wreckage, or I forget the name of the Deafening Clarion, sorry. Build toward their sweepers so that they can get you on turn 5. But again, if you have a counter spell, it's just an utter blowout, and they tend to lose the match right there. The weakness of Jeskai is that they don't have the hand disruption. They can't clear the way of your counter spells. Probably Esper would be a tougher matchup. So in this matchup, I take out the Moment of Craving. I take out both cast downs, because if they have creatures, they tend to be Lyra Dawnbringers, which are legendary and you can't get them. Lyra is basically lights out for you if she comes down. So Thought Erasure is very important to tag a Lyra, even more so than a Teferi. I can let a Teferi resolve before I let a Lyra resolve, because Teferi is much easier to deal with, and Bedevil is very important as well. So I also take out the 3 shocks. I take out the 1 mission briefing, and I take out the 1 Spell Pierce. Now that's negotiable, but there's definitely 7 cards that are coming out. The Craving, the 2 cast downs, the 3 shocks, and the mission briefing. I bring in all 4 duress, I bring in 3 negates, and the 8th card is Disdainful Stroke, which can get the Lyra Dawnbringer. I bring that in for the Spell Pierce. If you wanted to be super aggressive, you could keep the Pierce at the expense of the Disdainful Stroke, but you'd be aiming to win by turn 5. The other matchup that I played was Azorius Aggro, which is actually what beat me in the semi-final. I won game 1 quite comfortably because I resolved a Drake early, and I just protected it from the limited removal. They tend to play 4 of those Conclave Tribunals, and it's quite easy to protect with Spell Pierce and Dive Down, and you can just race them faster than they can. So game 1 is pretty easy. The problem is game 2, they bring in Negates and Spell Pierces, and that can be a real blowout in the other way. And that's why I said at the start in the deck tech, I'd look at a sweeper. I didn't have access to a sweeper, and I think that would make a huge difference in that matchup. But I was comfortably beaten in the next 2 matches. And the final one I played was the Mardu aggro, which was kind of like the Esper mid-range deck, except for it was playing red for, I think, Judith. So he was playing more aggressive than the Esper deck plays. And again, I found that pretty easy to win that matchup, because even though they can go wide, they don't have the huge creature. You can tag them and win on 2 turns, you know, with an 8 power Drakes. And they just can't beat you fast enough. The absolute key in this matchup is to kill the hero of Precinct 1, because he's the one that generates all the advantage for them. And I already have a ton of ways to do that, and it's much the same as with the Azorius aggro deck. If I had access to a sweeper, then I would be vastly improved in this matchup as well, I think. So that's my deck tech. Let me know what you guys think about it, what you think of the deck, what changes you might make, and if you play it, please let us know how it goes. Thanks for watching.